Okay, I'm not promising to fix it all, but let's see where it takes us. Can you read it from the back?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you can all read it. Okay, cool, and you can hear me. Okay, excellent stuff. I have come from the future. The year is 2030. We made it through the polycrisis. It's not just climate change. It's not just the 6th mass extinction event. It's not just that we're losing our agricultural soils at a pace that we cannot even begin to imagine. It's not just the housing crisis. You know, all of the many things that are there. There is just this one big polycrisis. But I won't even use the term that I've heard, but it's, anyway. But the point is that we made it through. That's the big thing. We made it through that gap. So we're looking at more things than just climate here, although that is one of them. And it is beautiful. Looking back from 2030, what I'm looking at is amazing. It's beyond our wildest dreams. Here are some of the ways that we got there. So can you guys read that? No? That's pretty. It's amazing. Okay. Basically, there's lots of arenas that we can look at. We can look at climate, biodiversity, soils, fresh waters, oceans, stuff, money, people, and change making. There's lots of different elements as we look at the world. Climate is definitely a really, really crucial one of those, but it's not everything. We're not able to reduce this crisis. I need to remember that I'm in 2030. We were not able to reduce this crisis down to just one thing, down to just one metric. It wouldn't fit into spreadsheets. You know, we weren't able to do that. Our data sets weren't big enough to encompass the things that we needed to encompass. Variability, love, you know, space for heart, an awakening, managing to communicate with one another. Those were all things that we did within that intervening time that made all the difference. So let me see. In terms of climate, we basically stopped wasting food. I mean, 1/3 of global food was wasted back in 2024. Do you know, 1/3, that's 1/3 of all the carbon emissions that went with that waste. 1/3 of all of the resources that went into it. 1/3 of all the soils that were washed away because of the way that we used to farm back then. Do you know what we used to do in 2024? We mixed nitrogen fertilizers and in, you know, concentrated urea form, spread it on the soil, and when that landed on the soil, it used to react with the soil carbon, and it just evaporated that carbon straight into the air. And we knew that that was happening. We had terms like there are 50 harvests left or 30 harvests left. That was the language that we were using at that time, just looking at the seriousness of the situation, because we were literally washing away our soil. And one of those issues was that nitrogen fertilizer. You get that reaction and the carbon just evaporates into the air. What happens then is what many people call climate change at the time. When it rained, because the carbon was gone, the carbon was the element that tied together the glomalin glues that made the humus. Humus holds 20 times its own weight in water. Now, I mean, I know that in 2030, we all know that. It's common knowledge because it's so important. But at the time, we were just wasting carbon everywhere. It was just hemorrhaging. If you looked at aerial maps from the time, you could see whole continents bleeding into the sea. That was our soil, that was our capacity to grow food for ourselves was just washing away completely. And we managed to address that and turn it around completely. All of our infrastructure 10 years ago, 5 years ago, was focused on liquid cycling of nutrients, using slurries, using artificial nitrogen, that type of thing. We shifted that completely to solid nutrient cycling. So we introduced infrastructure for proper composting, reintroducing compost onto the soil. Do you know what we were building? We were building carbon storage in the fields. So everywhere you look, the fields are getting deeper and deeper. The soil is getting richer and richer still all the time, and will continue to do so ad infinitum. We're building soil carbon, building the capacity to allow drainage in the west of Ireland, which we saw getting a lot wetter over that time, and also soil moisture holding in the east of the country, particularly where droughts were increasingly becoming a problem. And we were already seeing signs of that in the early 2020s. So it was one of the things that we we did with climate in order to make massive changes. And every one of these is interrelated. As we looked at soils, building humus and cycling nutrients, also supporting huge amounts of soil biodiversity. We knew at the time that we were facing into the sixth mass extinction event. That was unrolling. That was happening. We were watching species dying out at a rate of 1,000 times baseline level. And that suddenly we woke up one morning and discovered that actually we couldn't quite live with ourselves with that. The schizophrenia of carrying on an ordinary society while killing off whole species, we just couldn't cope with that mentally anymore. By about 2025, the mental health levels were just at a critical level because of that disconnect. And so by building soil biodiversity with microbes, with fungi, we just achieved miracles that the chemical green revolution couldn't even have hoped to imagine. You know, there were just amazing advances because we did the things that we knew worked, rather than believing the lobbyists. The lobbyists had had Brussels handcuffed, basically. And once we could see that, we were able to let it go. And you could see the signs of it changing over time. Between 2020 and 2025, every car ad was showing how amazing cars were for the environment. I mean, you used to turn on the radio and turn on the TV, and every car manufacturer was falling over itself, trying to pretend how green it was. Between 2025 and 2030, now, we just saw that that was bullshit, completely. And we began to step away from it and look and say, no, do you know what? We actually want something different. And we managed to achieve that. We saw beyond the whole facade of doublespeak. Doublespeak, like, I shouldn't even start. I shouldn't go down my watery tangents just yet. But just as an example of doublespeak, we used to call them waterborne diseases. Do you remember that? Yeah, they were diseases of shit. Once we called them diseases of shit, we began to deal with our shit rather than dumping it into our drinking water. We saw that madness of our language and we changed that around completely. And we looked at the rivers and the streams and we just embraced them and loved the places that we loved. And that made all the difference. So what else did we do? With our biodiversity, one of the things that we were at risk of doing, but we managed to avoid, was building spreadsheets that gave us climate models that meant we had to go cutting down forests to put in solar parks. And we looked at the insanity of that, and we saw, oh, the habitats, they are the organs of this earth that we live on. We need to put those back in. We can't have a healthy earth body without healthy earth organs. And we began to rebuild habitat everywhere. As we built habitat, we stored gigatons of carbon. We stored that water. The weather events got more and more extreme, but the land management changes that we made kept pace with those, stored the water on the land, held onto it, slowed down its release into the sea. So by reintroducing those habitats, by stepping back from land that wasn't farmable anyway, the land was only kept open because of European grants that meant that there was more areas to sell chemicals to spray. There's so much land that just isn't suitable for farming anyway. We can step back from that. The whole Shannon Callows, from Fermanagh down to Kerry and Limerick, became a rewilded corridor. It was incredible to watch it. Just stepping back from that and watching that rebound was so exciting. So what else was there? Species diversity, the perception of biodiversity. Instead of looking at it as an inconvenience, we were able to look at that and really see ourselves in the world around us. We are the habitats in which we live. We are, I know we're what, is it 75% water by cellular weight? Water is a very small molecule. And this was something that by 2030 we all knew. So I know I'm talking to people who know this already. But basically, by molecular count, we're actually 99% water. I am the catchment that I drink from. And we all realize that. So as we look at the land, we see ourselves in that. We turn on the tap and we're drinking and nourishing that 99% of us. I am water, looking at water. We realized the importance of that water and began to treat it as sacred again. How do you even move if you don't have water and you don't have air and you don't have good soil? How do you do anything? You can't. those things needed to be re-sanctified. We needed to recognize the sacred in those things again, because you can't put a number on them. You just can't put a figure on them at all. And that's what we realized. But in doing that, we had to look at money. We had to look at money and stuff and people. And those were crucially important things. And we explored lots of economic models. We explored degrowth, and we tried that out. And that was really good insofar as it was. We just banned fossil fuels outright. It was too late to have a slow step down, so it was uncomfortable for a few years. Very, very uncomfortable. But we just said, okay, you know, I don't know how much fossil fuel money it took to convince us that farmers were the problem. Do you know? But we basically just capped the wells and said, no, it's too dangerous. Do you know? I mean, you know, we ban contract killers, you know, and we banned the fossil fuel industry. You know, it's a genocidal practice that simply doesn't work. But we found so many other ways of doing it. Even by the 2020s, even by the early 2020s, solar energy was cheaper than gas at that point anyway. It was just the slowness of the process. It was habits, policies, protocols, they all kind of got in our way, but we managed to get around those. We could see that the scale of the challenges that were in front of us were so large that the shifts needed to be made really, really quickly. But we talked to one another. We began to have conversations, like that conversations that were being had between farmers and academics and environmentalists, where you begin to get those areas of overlap. And one of the things we did, we went to Taiwan in about 2026. Taiwan had been using a social media platform. I don't know why I'm getting emotional about Taiwan, but basically what they did in the lead up to the elections in the early 2020s was they built social media platforms that encouraged communication and collaboration and connection. Unlike the social media platforms that we knew in 2024, where it was actually, the more divisive the conversation, the more money the social media platform made. And we just switched that around. And we rebuilt our infrastructure following the example in Taiwan, who were under pressure from China at the time. And they wanted to create social cohesion in Taiwan that transcended the usual bickering thing. And we managed to employ those technologies. And the connections that we made were just phenomenal. And the pace of change. Do you know the way that change happens at the speed of trust? And we rebuilt society at that level of trust for that collaboration to be able to occur quickly. And it really did. We watched with amazement as the changes that we didn't think were possible just rolled out in front of us. I'm going to look at fresh waters very, very briefly, because I have a tendency to talk for too long. Still, I've been practicing this for, you know, the last 5 years. I've been talking to myself in front of a mirror all the way from 2025 to 2030, trying to slow it down, and still I take too long. But anyway, I don't sing in the shower. I talk to myself. So in every urban space, we just added loads of aquatic habitat. We added water, we added plants, the insects came, the wildlife came, and we just rebuilt biodiversity so quickly using ponds. It happened first in about 2023 with Burren Biohare's Corner project, and that spread through the biodiversity officers that were all in every county by 2024. They were in every county by that early. And since then, their staff numbers have grown and grown and grown. We have about 100 biodiversity officers now in every county working, because there is so much work to do still. Still at 2030, when we've done so much, there's so much more to do. And aquatic habitats were one of the really easy, quick ways to bring back in wildlife. This is a stormwater wetland in Denmark, and that was as old as 2020. And that's the cycle route to school. I loved the Danish approach to health and safety. In fairness, falling in there or getting run over by an Arctic truck, I know which one I'd take. So anyway, that was that. We did little things. There were really small things. We built little pocket pools down along drain sides. You know, that dammed the roads. While we had cars on the roads, they were cleaning up the microplastics and the oils and filtering those as they made their way through the landscape. On a bigger scale, do you remember the motorways that we used to have before we put in the high-speed rail network everywhere? Those motorways fed into these big wetland areas. We grazed them at the side, so you've got your food growing as well at the same time. And we put carp in there. So we shifted across from, you know, really, really bad for you, fish farming, in fairness, to really healthy freshwater fish production. It was amazing the things that we could do in every farm in the country. By the way, what Philip was saying about those leaky log dams, back as early as 2024, I think by about November in 2024, the EIP, the Waters EIP programme, funded under the Department of Agriculture, rolled out a whole suite of measures. And so I was involved at the time in helping with the documentation, training the agri-advisors, and that document was published in November in 2024. So it's there, it's on Teagasc's desk. Sorry, I'm slipping roll. So, but seriously, that document is on the way. It's currently it's sitting on a Teagasc desk in Middleton as I speak. So we planted drains. It slowed down the flow of the water. The flooding that we look at and call climate change, and the droughts that we look at and call climate change, it's a land and water management issue. You know, what we've been doing for generations is getting rid of water as quickly as possible. What we started doing was we started recognizing that, oh, we don't need to get rid of it. We can hold on to it. We can create biodiverse areas. We can store this on the land. You know, in exactly the type of things that Philip was talking about 5 years ago. And so those are things that we rolled out. We rolled those out on every farm in the country, and the speed of the rollout was assisted by the department funding, but it was made so much faster because every local village that had the risk of flooding really got behind it and encouraged every farmer to adopt every measure. And the farmers were, you know, they were well paid for it, which was fantastic because it's a really, really important service that land offered. And this, it doesn't look like rocket science, but it's these type of small measures that made all the difference everywhere. We combined water filtration with food production. So we rolled out watercress beds over many of the final stages of the farm filter systems. And so what we're doing is producing absolutely delicious, really high vitamin C vegetables in a lot of areas that actively mop up the nitrates and phosphates that come out of the residual settlement areas. There's not as much leakage of nitrates and phosphates by any means as there was 5 years ago, but it's now all going through these big watercress beds of several acres in size. And so what you've got is this circular, I mean, a genuine circular economy. We used to call it a circular economy in 2024. Do you remember that? When it was fossil fuel ignited. You can't, I mean, we came to that realization. You cannot run a circular society on fossil fuel. You know, you're not going to get that stuff back in the ground again. You just need to cut it out completely and have it full cycle. You also couldn't run it on recycling because the recycling infrastructure takes too much energy. So you need to run it on a whole reuse infrastructure. Reuse, repair, reuse, all of that kind of stuff. Recycling is, you know, I mean, as you all know, because you've been hearing about it for the last 3 years odd in the media as they've really pushed that message that recycling was so way back further than yesterday. Okay, it just didn't work. We needed to just completely revamp it so that recycling was an old habit pattern. And what I personally really love now is to be able to walk anywhere in the country and drink from any stream anywhere in the country. Just to be able to lie down on the grass, put my head on my chin and just look in and watch the insects just crawling in along under the water surface. All of those really important species that tolerate only the very most clean water, and those are making a comeback. They were really being hammered. By 2024, we were down to 1% of the waterways in the country that were able to support those really vulnerable species. The ones that really need high oxygen levels in the water, 1%. And it had been 1% since about 2015. So there was a big block of time where we knew that this was a problem and we weren't dealing with it at all. And by having pristine water all over the country, we've managed to pull that back to 5%, which is that's a 5-fold spread in the cover of those habitats. And that's growing year on year as we really grapple with water and how precious that water is to us all now. It was always precious, but we've only just come to realize it. There were really, really simple basic measures that we did. You know, 8% of global energy used to go into pumping water out of the ground, filtering it, using it, pumping it back into the ground, treating it, all of that water infrastructure stuff used to take a massive chunk of energy. Do you know what happened? By putting in water butts all over Dublin, we managed to shelve the Irish water plan to pipe the Shannon across to the east. And personally, living west of the Shannon, I was okay with that. Okay, so rain planters, that was another thing we did. What the rain planters actually did, they were a very, very easy rollout early on. By 2025, every house in the country had a rain planter where it could fit it at all. And what that did was that it prevented the stormwater, which is the water that lands on the roof, from getting into the combined sewers. When that happens in the older parts of urban areas, it actually washes through the sewage straight into the sea in high rainfall. And we were only just beginning to get our heads around that. By rolling out rain planters, we just slowed down that movement really effectively, even in areas where there was really little space, where you couldn't put in a big stormwater wetland. So we've become really used to having lovely little pockets of pollinator pots all over our urban spaces. And it's just lovely to walk around. Even by 2020, a bumblebee in London was never more than 300 meters from a green roof. Wasn't that amazing? Even then, even back 10 years ago. Whereas now, a bumblebee can pretty much get fed every 10 or 15 meters. Which is great because the insects really needed our help. We were in the middle of the insect apocalypse. We really were. I mean, witness the bug spatter. By the mid-2020s, the bug spatter was what? Nil on your windscreen? And that was a measure. I mean, I really disliked horsefly bites. In fact, even in 2030, I still really dislike horsefly bites. But you know what I really love is watching the swallows playing and the bats playing and the swifts flying overhead, eating great big juicy horseflies, that have just eaten me. So I can watch my blood flying around the sky. There we go. And we did something that not all of you might have liked, because people used to love to flush. So it took a little bit of an education process. But basically, for those who really loved to flush, we were still okay. We still had a solution. We introduced urine diverting toilets all over the country. So all that fertilizer that we needed for the fields that we weren't getting any longer for the fossil fuel companies. I mean, Putin was probably the best environmentalist of the last couple of decades, because he just pushed the price of fertilizer through the roof. Nitrogen and phosphorus, I wonder would that be useful? Ladies and gents alike, please sit down and remain seated for the entire performance for maximum fertilizer recapture. Okay? There was a great model that publicans all over the country began to roll out. They sold their clientele beer initially. They made sure that they peed before leaving the building and then sold them liquid fertilizer afterwards. There was a French company that about 10 years ago, back around 2020, came up with l'oratoire, I can't pronounce it at all, basically a little plastic sheet that was folded around to make a funnel, plug it into a straw bale, they're your festival toilets, away you go. And then after the festival, you take away your bales, and the carbon in the bales reacts with the nitrogen in the fertilizer to melt down into amazing humus. We needed that humus. We were losing humus at a rate of knots, and we needed to get humus back out of the land. So going to music festivals became one of the routes for reintroducing humus into our fields. We used aquatron settlement systems. So the aquatron takes out the fecal material in sewer, so the person up at the other end doesn't even need to know. Or for those people who were happy to use compost toilets, they were rolled out way more quickly. Do you know what we do? Sewage. Sewage as a term. Do you remember that term? No, you've probably forgotten it at this stage. Because what it was perfectly good organic matter. That was carbon. You can sequester twice as much carbon using compost toilets as you can by composting sewage sludges. So it's carbon, it's fertilizer, nitrates and phosphates, and it's perfectly good drinking water. So we kind of disbanded the whole word sewage, and we looked at resource cycling, and we found lots and lots of different ways. There were as many ways to deal with that issue as there are people here tonight. And so that was one of the things that we addressed. We also looked at habitats on a broad scale. This was a farm pond that I put in about 7 years ago. It was in 2022, I think it was, something like that, 2023. And it's in a farm drain. So what it does is it filters the water coming off the land. Still, to this day, it's become slightly more encroached with plants now in 2030, but that does an even better job of taking up nitrates and phosphates. In every farm in the country, even by 2024, farmers were absolutely banging down the doors of the various organisations that were beginning to fund farm ponds. They loved the idea. The farmers loved the land. They loved the land. They loved being out on the land. And they've become, not now, of course, but up until about mid-2025, they had been so tied into a system that by design divorced them from the land that they loved. You know, they were just pushed away from it. And I was talking to farmers as early as 2020, and they were saying, I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. And now I've shifted to conservation agriculture. I'm building carbon. I'm keeping plants on the land. I'm doing holistic planned grazing with livestock. I jump out of bed in the morning, and my kids are suddenly interested. You know, and I'm not depressed any longer. And that's what they were saying even 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. And so that change was massive. They were putting in ponds left, right and centre, and it was just a joy to watch all that rolling out. And naturally, the insect species on land around it absolutely loved it. The bird species began to bounce back. We'd been seeing falling numbers of all of those, and that just bounced back wonderfully because the recovery rate was phenomenal. Once you create space for wildlife and begin to bring back in the keystone species, the recovery is incredible. And of course, we brought in beavers in early 2026, which I loved. I was thrilled to bits because I really wanted beavers, because my business card, when I printed, read Féidhlim Harty, consultant beaver, advises on ponds and dams. And so the real thing meant that I could put my feet up. I put my feet up for about 3 days and I loved it. And so it was really nice to have that bit of a break. And then of course it was back to work because naturally there was a lot to be done. But what beavers did, they slowed the flow of water, they filter the water, they prevent floods, they prevent the droughts, they improve fish stocks. All of those things unfold when you bring the beavers back into the landscape. They're dealing with the climate change, flood, drought thing as you just watch them unfolding in the landscape. They improve the habitat, all of that. We didn't quite get wolves back yet. We haven't got that far, but you know, it's on the cards. But what we do have, so we've got the beaver, that's cool, okay? So we haven't got everything in 2020-30. We do have the beaver. This is the European bison, okay? So they're in Poland and Germany and that kind of place. There's a few in Spain, actually, that were introduced in 2023, I think it was. The wolf in the early 2020s was making its way west from after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Wolves were breeding in Denmark by 2022. And so moving steadily westwards, the sea was a bit of a challenge. You know, it kind of got in the way a little bit. I know they were native to Ireland. Not everybody was really enthusiastic, you know, so we haven't done it yet. But what we did find, do you know, the magic about rewilding? Rewilding involves two really important elements. You give land back to nature, and you bring nature back into the land. You don't just retreat and cross your fingers. You specifically invite everyone to the party. So when you retreat from a large area of land, the European bison is invited back in. The beaver is invited back in. The wolf is invited back in. If you don't have a wolf, if you don't happen to have a bison, that's okay. We actually had lots of proxies for large grazing animals in the Irish landscape. So this is Charlie from Common Knowledge in Lisdoonvarna. And Charlie is being managed by a farmer who's practicing holistic planned grazing. A lovely American guy called Zach. Zach is the wolf. So what he does is he does what wolves do. He keeps the cows on the move. By keeping the cows on the move, we reduced the parasite load. You change the dynamic of the footfall. You increase the biodiversity. You increase the soil carbon storage. And all of those things we did really, really quickly because we already had these guys and we already had the IFA sitting there, ready and waiting to be the wolf. So it was a match made in heaven. So we did all that, and it was amazing. We also introduced really broad riparian corridors. The issue with rewilding, you've core protected spaces, corridors between those protected spaces, and then carnivores or keystone species. We introduced corridors in every river corridor and stream corridor in the country. And what was amazing about this, as you all know, because you all walk them at least once a day, is that we had walkways now all over the country. You had spaces for otters to move all over the country. We removed the dams, so you had space for fish to move all over the country. And so we actually, I hope there's no really hard and fast structural historians here, we removed Ardnacrusha in 2027. We could no longer justify keeping the salmon out, you know, for a full century. So we'd simply removed it, rewilded the River Shannon, and it was just, I feel emotional as I say it, it was just an amazing event to watch it being dismantled and to see lamprey moving up the river for the first time in almost 80 years, 90 years. The salmon were getting past, most of the salmon were getting past the fish passages to some extent. Eels weren't. Eels were getting chopped up, if you remember. There were eel bits floating down the Shannon up until the point when we actually removed the turbines completely. There were other ways of generating electricity and we didn't need that one, but the rewilding of the River Shannon and the Shannon corridor was just one of those incredible things to watch unfold on so many different levels. I know I'm close to the wire. I'm nearly in 2031. It's nearly midnight on the 31st of December, but I'll keep talking for just a few more minutes if you'll bear with me, because there were some practical things that we did. There were 5 things that we did, and if you can remember these 5 things and just, you know, give them to memory, then, you know, you'll be able to tell the future generations what it was that we actually did in order to make the shift. So can you read that at all? No? How we arrived at this amazing new future? We fed the right wolf. There's 2 wolves in the Native American stories. One is mean and nasty and, you know, fearful. The other is generous and kind and nurturing. We fed the one that worked. When we pulled out our pockets and spent real money rather than plastic, so we could hang on to it and have a certain amount of control over it rather than central bank digital currency, which we said, nah, don't want that, thanks very much. We spent our money consciously. When it came to a decision about, do I buy this item of food that is going directly to fund Monsanto, which I do not want, or do we buy this item of food that directly supports my neighbour that farms without chemicals? We thought, oh, the difference is only 100% of the price of the food. I'm going with the slightly more expensive one that gives me a much nicer future. That's what I choose to do. And everybody suddenly noticed that they couldn't, with a clean conscience, support the industries that were doing all of the damage and paying for all the lobbyists that managed to keep the policies strangleheld. We practiced voluntary simplicity. We just did less. We just spent less money. We put our feet up. We enjoyed the sunshine. We took it easier. You know, we were getting so busy. We were falling over ourselves. We were so busy trying to make money, trying to keep up, you know, but it wasn't actually necessary. It was all a bit of a farce, the whole thing. So we just took it easy, you know. The 4-day week helped, but then we went further than that again and just began to only do the things we loved. So the people who cleaned toilets for a living, they were making a fortune. Nobody else wanted to do it. We spoke truth to power. This was one of the most surprising things at all. It's a Quaker phrase, speaking truth to power. And it's always been useful. It's what got women the vote. It's what got Ireland its freedom. It's what, you know, did lots and lots of things. It was really potent. What we noticed around 2025 was that as we began to do that, the people within the industries and within the government bodies that we were talking to, we began to see that they wanted exactly the same things that we did, actually. But they couldn't maneuver in their jobs because they had to make as much money for their organizations as possible. So they loved getting that pressure because it gave them an excuse to go out and make the small changes everywhere that they knew they needed to make, but they couldn't make because of the profit motive that got in the way all the time. So Jack Charlton, I think, started it way back when. That must have been 50 years ago at least. You know, put him under pressure. We engaged in advocacy, and it worked. It was so quick. We did the right thing because that was what we knew in our hearts was the right thing to do. We practiced advocacy because we wanted to change the whole thing. We held hands. We got together. We built communities. We found networks of people that we could engage with at a heart level. And we clung on for dear life to them. And we worked with them and we worked together. And in that way, we managed to blinker out the bullshit that was trying to come in around the edges. because there was so much greenwashing going on. It was just getting so confusing. You know, I mean, you remember 10 years back, the whole Trump years thing. Trump was only a product of a natural progression anyway. Did he win? He did. But he had a heart attack on the podium, unfortunately, and they found that working together was far better than working divisively. And so what happened was that we built communities from the ground up, because we found that the top-down notions just really weren't working anymore. We built that groundswell, and we found that the changes happened so quickly. If we could filter out, when we discovered that actually, by blinking out most of what's going on in the world, I can see something directly in front of me, and I can do it. Whereas once we began to open our field of view, we were paralyzed about the thing that we could do that was right in front of us. So we began to really come from our own experience. What was important to me was the thing that I did. What I could do was the thing that I engaged in. And I knew that there were people all over the world. Even by 2015, it was the biggest single global movement that had ever existed. And so by knowing that, by realizing that, we were able to take our eye off of those balls that we couldn't juggle and focus directly on the thing that we could do on our own job, whatever that happened to be. And by doing that, we simply watched miracles unfold around us. And the final thing that we did, which was crucially important, we held the vision. We nurtured the miracle. We knew at the time that it would take a miracle to get through the mess that we'd built for ourselves. And we'd built the mess collectively and all that. That's all true, that's all grand. But we had a lot of help building that mess from some very, very highly paid people who were paid to lie to us for 50 years. Okay? And so by holding a really clear vision, we began, do you know what we realized in about 2025? We realized that Newtonian physics had been dead for 100 years. Newtonian physics was telling us that whoever has the most power will have the most force. And that was what Newtonian physics was telling us in analogy. And we began to realize that miracles were actually right in front of us. The quantum physics that had been around for 100 years said that if you do something over here with enough clarity and intent, miracles unfold over here. Something strange goes on. You know, what we did was we looked at that, we embraced the strange. We embraced one another, held people of different colors, of different species, because there was lots of migration. The last 5 years has seen an unprecedented amount of migration. People walking away from the messes that have been created until their landscapes are restored again, because most people actually want to live at home, if home is tenable at all. And what we found, humans are a keystone species too. We've been a hyper-keystone species, such as our disproportionate impact on the landscape around us. Generally, we were desert-making species in the past. You look at the Dust Bowl, you look at the outback, these are all human-made landscapes. And one of the ways that we dropped sea levels again, began to see that fall again, one of the ways that we started to rehydrate the Amazon basin again, is we began to hold water on the land again. And there were example sites around since 2010 odd, 2000 even, since the turn of the century. There were examples all over the place. And we began to learn from those examples and regreen the deserts all around us. We regreened the deserts. It created vast areas where we could begin to grow food in a way that was really genuinely ecologically sustainable. It cooled down the earth in those locations as well. Not everything. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done going forward into the next 5 years to 2035. But we've managed to get through that gap, and we've seen how potent it can be if we hold hands together and we hold a really, really strong, really clear vision in our heart. The brain, we found this out, the brain is magnetic. Okay, sorry, the brain is electrical, so it'll send electrical signals. The heart is magnetic. So if we can hold that electrical signal and then magnetize to it and draw that in, as we utilize that energy, as environmental movements, we stopped going for the fear thing. we realized that actually fear was a tool that had been used for 100 years. And we thought, nah, I'm fed up with that. What I want is something so much better. And as we did that, we changed everything. Thank you very much.